It's nice to be in a place, unlike my South Louisiana town, when you have sunshine but no mosquitoes and no humidity. And you might think I'm kidding, it's just March, but we started having our mosquitoes in mid-February. And when I was listening to Ted talk about place and thinking about place and how place shapes your thinking, I couldn't help but recall how my particular little town on the Mississippi River had to shape, or ought to have shaped, the thinking of this one good old boy. On Mardi Gras Day this year, he was driving up on the road from the river back up into town, and he either hit a patch of ice or wasn't paying attention, and he went off the curb in the road and with his pickup truck and sailed into the gator pit. It really is a gator pit in town. It's a swampy area where there are gators. And by the time they got the rescue people down there to get him, the truck was almost entirely underwater. The gators had not been disturbed yet. The old boy had not missed too many meals, and so when he crawled into the rescue boat, he sank it. So they had to all drag him to the shore. This was front page news locally, and I think that it was a good reminder to everybody in town. Think about where you are on the road here, especially if you're driving by the gator pit. Well, it's strange that anybody would have to explain to people why place matters. I've been reading a lot of Dante recently, and the idea that place is irrelevant or largely irrelevant to one's life would be inconceivable to him. It tells us something about the infernal modern world that we have to remind ourselves about what every human being until virtually the day before yesterday took as a given. But we do. And that's why a book like Why Place Matters, and the conversations it will spark here and elsewhere, is so important to our time and our place. We Americans have always been restless and have conceived of liberty as the absence of restraint. We are the world's quintessentially modern people. Even the dominant school of conservatism is essentially libertarian. Republican or Democrat, if you want to get elected president in America, you had better position yourself as a candidate of more freedom. But free for what? If we are free to choose, how shall we choose? Americans don't like to be reminded of this. We think we can do anything we want. But the human condition is limited by nature. We are creatures who live and die. We have to live and die somewhere. In fact, I was thinking recently, if you want to know where you should live, a good question to ask yourself is where you would like to die. The places we live matter because, as Bill McClay says in the book, quoting Winston Churchill, we shape our buildings, and afterwards, our buildings shape us. It's also true of our landscape, built and natural. But we modern people aren't bound psychologically and otherwise to places like the Tuscans of the High Middle Ages were. Yet Dante was right, still is right, usually is right. In the Divine Comedy, he explores the medieval concept of habitus, the idea that the experiences we have in everyday life unavoidably shape our characters and therefore our destinies. I feel it every time I come to LA. This place is so light that it seems sometimes that I might just float right off the continent. I grew up in a small town in Louisiana, where I live now, a place that's profoundly anchored in historical consciousness. My house is right behind the Masonic Lodge and right across the street from the Episcopal Church, which is, I think, the second oldest Episcopal church in the Louisiana Purchase. A stone's throw from my backyard, where our chickens are, was where, on one day during the Civil War, the war stopped. The officers from a Union gunboat in the Mississippi had contacted the local Confederates, they were all Freemasons, and asked, we said, our commander is dead. He had died of yellow fever, I believe it was. May we bring him up the hill and give him a Masonic burial in your cemetery? And the Masons said, well, of course, he's a brother Mason. They stopped the war. The Confederate soldiers greeted the Union soldiers as they marched up the hill bearing the body of their commander. They went into the Grace Episcopal Church cemetery, held a Masonic burial, put the captain into the ground there with full Masonic honors, went back to their places, and resumed the war. That sort of thing just doesn't happen everywhere, but it happened in my little town. And so all this historical consciousness weighs very much on the minds of people there. But I can see why the placelessness or the general placelessness of Los Angeles would appeal to some people. But it makes me, given my background, anxious. Though poet and native Angelino Dana Gioia's essay in Why Place Matters puts me in an unfamiliar place. It makes me want to come back to LA and spend more time trying to dig deeper here. Because what he did was show me why Los Angeles means so much to him. I was able to enter into his experience of Los Angeles for a brief time, and it opened my mind and maybe opened my heart a little bit. What I enjoyed most about Dana Gioia's essay was not his reasonable defense of LA's worth as a place, but the palpable joy the poet takes in it being his place. It was the place that made him. Even though he grew up in Hawthorne, a part of the city he admits in his essay is, quote, a poor, rough, ugly town, unquote. Gioia does not nostalgize the Hawthorne of his youth, but in his short essay, he pays homage to the people, customs, and institutions there that made it so meaningful to him. Gioia could live anywhere in the country. As you may know, he was the poet laureate of the United States. But he's chosen to move back to Los Angeles, not, one surmises, because it's a great place, though certainly it is to him, but because it's his place. It meant everything to him. Why Place Matters, the book, presents a variety of essays, some philosophical, some ruminative, some policy-oriented, others political, and still others economic. For me, Gioia's impressionistic tribute to his hometown encapsulates the ultimate goal of the book, to reawaken an awareness of how important it is to have a place to call one's own, to have a place to call one's home, and how we can work together to create or recreate places worth calling one's own, which claim our love and our loyalty. And as Bill McClay cautions, we have to do it within the bounds of American life as it actually is, not as it can be imagined to be. But we also must be able to imagine that we really can discover a deeper, better way of life through what Ted McAllister, in a felicitous phrase, calls, quote, the creative energies of richly encumbered lives. Now this is a big challenge in a culture that believes in self-realization through making one's subjective desires an absolute good. First, as Notre Dame architecture professor Philip Best puts it in his essay, we moderns no longer believe in what he calls metaphysical realism. It's a fancy term meaning that we doubt that there are certain givens in life around which we have to build our lives. Rather, we're the sort of people who want to keep our options open, in part because we believe we can be and should be whoever we choose to be. If we have no faith that reality, broadly speaking, is a given and can be known, we will find it difficult to find common ground. How can we settle on plans to build good places if we can't agree on what defines a good life, or even that such a definition exists independent of the individual? A second and related point is made by the political theorist Mark T. Mitchell in the book, that we live in a society that elevates the autonomous individual and celebrates individual choice as the apex of human existence. Mark Mitchell condemns this as, quote, the empire of individual choice, a phrase that recalls Pope Benedict's denunciation of the dictatorship of relativism. It may be a tyranny, but it is one that most people in our country seem to be happy with, or at least one they cannot imagine doing without. Drug addicts are like that too. These are the boundaries within which our conversation about place has to occur. The philosopher Charles Taylor famously defined our time as a secular age, not because people in it are not religious, many people certainly are, but because it's an era in which people understand religion as a choice. In the same way, I don't believe that we latter-day localists can make a convincing case for committing to place as something vital to human flourishing unless we do so in a way that makes people want to choose it. Not shame them into choosing, but make them desire to choose it. This, I think, is why the poet Dana Gioia's tribute to his hometown is so effective. It made me think of the things I loved about the place that made me. A tiny country county in South Louisiana called West Feliciana. It's a place that I left when I was a young man, a teenager, embittered and determined never to return. but I couldn't stop thinking about it, no matter how far I roamed. I moved to Washington, D.C. That was the first place I left out of the South. And I found when I lived in Washington that whenever I was at a bar or at a conference or at a party, the Southerners would tend to gravitate together, and we'd start telling stories about back home. And all our friends and colleagues who are from other parts of the country would come hang around and listen to us and say to us, "You're making that up." We're not making it up, that's how it really is. A lot of people, young people who leave the South, want to get out of the South, but the South never gets out of them. And sometimes, as in my case, you go back. Because no matter how far I roamed, I was always longing for home and for roots. It came to define much of my thinking and writing as a professional journalist and peripatetic cosmopolitan. Now, while I theorized about rootedness, place, and home for my various perches in New York City, Dallas, and Philadelphia, I was always running around, chasing the job, better job. My younger sister, Ruthie Lemming, lived it. Ruthie and I both went to LSU in Baton Rouge. She was 2 years younger than I. But she came home every weekend when we were in college to be with her high school sweetheart, the guy she married. She came home after college and started teaching in our local school, the same school she and I had gone to. She and her husband, Mike, built their house right across the yard. I can't even say street, it's a gravel road, from my mom and dad in the country. And that's where they started their family. They had a very simple life and a beautiful one. In 2010, at the age of 40, Ruthie was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. She had never smoked. She was in great health. It was just one of those things. She lived for 19 months and she died at home in the country in the arms of the man she had loved since she was 15 years old. I observed my sister's cancer journey mostly from Philadelphia, where I lived at that time with my wife and kids. But I stayed in close touch with her and my mom and dad, and we would call every day and talk. There was, as I recall, such a bright sadness in those days. Sad because she was dying. There was really nothing that could be done, and dying slowly and painfully. But they were bright because the faith, the hope, and the courage that she displayed on the long road to death put some core truths about what really matters in life in perspective for me and for a lot of people who were privileged enough to watch her go through this. And the way Ruthie's community, the community I had left behind because it was so conformist and narrow-minded to me as a teenager, the way that community turned out to support her and her family every single day of her terminal illness was an extraordinary act of communal love. It absolutely changed my life. I saw that the same community bonds that held me down and held me back when I was 16 were the only things holding my sister, her husband, their 3 children, and my mom and dad together through this long crisis. And I saw the value of having roots and nurturing a sense of place. The simple life Ruthie had in our little Mississippi River town, the creek party she would go to on the weekends, fishing on the pond, Sunday dinner at Mam and Pa's house, crawfish boils, all of these things added up to a whole life. It was as if she had been building all these years a levee against the possibility of a catastrophe, of a catastrophic flood. When the flood came in the form of terminal cancer and threatened to wipe her family out, the levee held. I knew that I couldn't count on anything like Ruthie had if I got sick. It's not because people are any worse in Philly or Dallas or New York or anywhere else I lived. It's because, unlike my sister, I had not lived in any one place long enough to put down roots. At Ruthie's wake there in the little Methodist church in our town, so many people whose faces I had never seen came to me and said, "Sir, you don't know me. She was my teacher. Here's what she did for me." Over and over and over. I saw kids who had nothing like. There was one little girl whose mother was in prison. She had been Ruthie's student the year Ruthie got sick. And she said to the other teachers, "Miss Lemming is gone. Who's going to love me now?" Ruthie had that kind of effect on all the students she spoke to and she dealt with. A lot of these kids came from very poor families and broken families, but she was there for them. One girl told me that Ruthie was the first adult who had ever shown her any love. And it's a story I tell in the book, and it's worth recounting very briefly here because it shows what it can mean to love the people put in front of you to love. Girl came from a very broken and poor family. Ruthie saw her. Ruthie taught her 6th grade math, and the girl's name was Shannon. And Ruthie would take her lunch, out breaks, and go sit on the playground with Shannon to give her extra tutoring, give her encouragement, and on and on and on. Shannon kept coming back to Ruthie when Shannon was in high school, and Ruthie would mentor her and give her encouragement when her own family was trying to tear her down. Shannon said to her one day, "I think I'd like to be a psychologist." Poor girls from West Feliciana Parish never even imagine they can go to college, much less that they can go be a psychologist. But Ruthie encouraged Shannon and said, "Sweet baby, whatever you want to do, you can do it. I believe in you and you believe in yourself." Today, Shannon works at the Neuropsych Center at UCLA. She has a husband and children of her own. She told me after Ruthie died, "Your sister was my angel." And I said, "Well, would you consider moving back home?" She goes, "I can't move back home. 3 of my brothers are in prison. I have no life back there, but your sister helped me find my life." That happened over and over, all because Ruthie stayed behind and loved the people she was given to love. I saw in the faces of these people and the voices of the students my sister had helped the spiritual grandeur and the moral greatness possible when you stay in one place and you love it and you love the people there with all your heart. I wanted that for myself. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, after watching what happened to my sister and with my sister, I could truly imagine myself living in that town. And I acted on it. My wife Julie and I decided to renounce the freedom I had cherished and move with our kids back to West Feliciana. We wanted to give our kids a life among extended family and a community in which they had long family roots, deep family roots, and to serve my sister's motherless children and my aging parents. My sister came up against the ultimate limit in life, death, as we all will one day. She went into darkness at the young age of 42, but her death illuminated the way home for me. Here's the point. I had all the why place matters theory in my head, but it took immersing my moral imagination, that is my heart, in an actual story to affect my conversion. Don't get me wrong, I think that we can and we should make strong practical arguments for why people should commit to place. I think we should work through public policy and other means to make it easier for ordinary people to choose commitment to place, and not just journalists who can work anywhere because, like me, I get to work anywhere because I can work online, but it's easy for me to choose place because of that. We need to make it easier for people who don't have the kind of privilege I do to choose to stay in place. But my experience with my hometown brings to mind a comment that Pope Benedict once made, that the best arguments for the Christian faith are the church's art and the church's saints. Why? Because they incarnate the Christian ideal, and in so doing, change hearts and change minds through revelation. To restate that principle for our purposes today, we might say that the best arguments for living in a particular place are the beauty one finds there and the kind of people those places produce. In my own case, my hometown, St. Francisville, is not a wealthy place, but it's a beautiful little village, the kind of place that you could be proud to call home and to take into your heart. Its beauty is not simply a matter of aesthetics, but it's constituted in part by the humane moral order made manifest in its structures and in its institutions, in its churches, in its civic organizations, in the way of life you find there. The argument that won me over to the town, though, was the saints it produced. That is, people like my sister Ruthie and all those who surrounded her and carried her and her family through the fire. My intellect had already been converted years ago on the importance of place, but it took seeing those convictions embodied in the lives of flesh and blood people to make them come alive in my own heart and to compel me to act on them. Also, a reason that particularly appealed to me as a writer became clear to me when I went home from Philly for my sister's funeral. I went over to her house the day I got there, and all her friends were gathered in the house in which she had died that morning, and they were laughing and telling stories and trying to keep my brother-in-law's spirits up. And that was very true to Ruthie. In that same kitchen, she had cooked for all her neighbors and her friends for so many years, and they had just been there together in that place, and now they were together again. Well, the next day, one of her friends came in, and a girl whose family lives across the state line on Highway 61 in Mississippi, And she said, "Y'all, did y'all hear that strip club they have up there near where Mama lives has a one-legged stripper?" I said, "No, that can't be. That's too Flannery O'Connor. That's too perfect." "No, I hear it's true." And we were all laughing about it. That can't really be true. Well, one of my brother-in-law, he's a firefighter, one of his firefighter colleagues comes in and hears what we're saying and says, "Oh, it's true, all right." He pulls out his BlackBerry, pop, 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 see, there she is. And there she was working that one leg on the pole. I was so blown away by this. I walked across the yard to tell my dad, who was on his back porch in the porch swing with his old farmer buddy. I said, "Daddy, you're not going to believe this, but," and I told him the story. And the old farmer says, "Oh, I heard about her. Old Terry, he went up there to give him a lap dance and her prosthesis fell off. He was mighty surprised." And it occurred to me, I am a writer. Why am I in Philadelphia? True story. But I have to tell you that, sadly, that things, and I wrote about this, by the way, this whole story of coming back home in my book, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming. But things have not worked out for me as I had hoped. And for a reason that's worth our attention this afternoon as we think about the meaning of place. 4 months after I came home, I discovered that my sister Ruthie had nurtured a grudge against me for many years. She thought I was a bad person for having left home, for having left our place, and betraying the family by going off to the city and getting above myself. I had absolutely no idea she felt that way. I knew there was tension there, but she was a good Southern girl, and Southerners are very polite and don't say what's really on their mind if it's going to cause people unpleasantness. But Southerners do hold a grudge like nobody's business. I was driving around West Feliciana with my dad last year. We were in a far rural northern part of the parish. I said, "Hey, Daddy, how come there's a little Methodist church there, the Concord Methodist Church? About a mile and a half away, there's the New Hope Methodist Church. And they share the same pastor. He goes to Concord at 9 and New Hope at 11. I don't get it." He said, "Well, that's the DeLee family church and that's the Spillman family church." "And?" He said, "Well," I looked at me like I was crazy. He said, "Well, back in the Civil War, one of those DeLees went AWOL from the Confederate Army and one of the Spillmans turned him in. They've hated each other ever since." "Wait, are you serious?" "Oh, yeah, serious. They've forgotten, most of them have forgotten the reason they hate each other, but by God, they're not going to let go of that, even if it means having two churches, Concord and New Hope." But anyway, I had no idea my sister harbored this grudge in her heart, nor did I know that she had raised her children to believe this about me, that I wasn't trustworthy because I had left home. Her college-age daughter, with whom I do have a relationship, spilled the beans. She told me, "I knew Mama was wrong because I got to know you when I got older, but my little sisters don't know this. You're going to have a very hard time getting close to them because they're not going to betray their sainted Mama." That's proven true. I have almost no relationship with them today. And my parents have also been kind of difficult for the same reason. As I told my folks in an argument I had, me and my family, we moved 1,100 miles for y'all, but y'all won't move a single inch for us. Good Southerners that they are. But here's the tragic result, though. Because my sister and my father loved family and loved place so fiercely and so supremely, and so resented what they considered to be my disloyalty to it, they have inadvertently foreclosed the possibility that our family can thrive together in that place into the next generations. In other words, they held on so tightly to what they loved that that iron grip has almost certainly killed the thing. This, believe it or not, is a surprisingly common phenomenon. It's probably happened to some of you in this room. I've learned this since writing the book. Many people have written to me and said, "Look, I'm open to going home and committing to place, but I can't do it because my family rejects me, or they won't have me back. Or I can't live in this town because I'm too different and I know how the town is." The basic reason, I think, is that a lot of people who stay behind love their place so much that they interpret any rejection of place and they interpret as betrayal, and they interpret any attempt to live even a little bit differently than the people there already live as a form of hostility and aggression. Similarly, they resist outsiders who relocate to the place as interlopers who are going to change this place and take what they love away from them, what they love about that place away from them. I've seen this play out not only in my family, but in other ways in my little town. The past 20 years has seen a migration of middle and upper middle class professionals out of the city of Baton Rouge, the state capital, which is about 30 miles away, into our little town. These outsiders have brought with them a different set of cultural habits and expectations. From my point of view, they brought new life to the town, but that's not a view that's widely shared by the natives. In my town, there have been several public fights over this. Neither side, in my view, neither the natives nor the newcomers, have clean hands. But the town itself has everything to lose by holding so tightly to its conservatism. The economy there has been declining. If we don't have some serious investment in job creation, the population is going to continue to decline, and it will be impossible for the sons and daughters of local families to come back, even if they want to. There has to be a material basis for the community. People don't just move away and fail to come back because they're selfish and want to do what they want to do. Sometimes they can't come back because there are no jobs. Our housing is unaffordable. What the old guard in my town has to realize is that things must change if they want them to stay the same. That is, if they want to hold on to what's best about this place they love, they have to figure out some way to allow change. To paraphrase Edmund Burke, a place without the means to change is a place without the means to ensure its own survival. Well, despite the difficult situation with my particular family, I don't regret for 1 second having moved back to that good place, St. Francisville. My wife and I have made lots of friends. We've renewed the relationship with my extended family, whom I hadn't really seen for over 20 years because I'd only come home for brief periods. And we've helped start a church. Right now we're organizing a literary festival for this spring in honor of the novelist Walker Percy, who set some of his fiction in our town. Bill McClay, my co-panelist, is going to be a panelist there at our Walker Percy weekend later this spring. Personally, I've experienced and am experiencing every single day what the Why Place Matters essayist Joseph Amato calls the great gift of local history. That is, an experience of local history that helps one to, quote, unlock the hidden meanings of self and world. As a writer, this has given me a new source of enthusiasm for my vocation, as well as new insights into how the world works, into how the world around me works, into how the world beyond West Feliciana works, and how the world in my own heart works, in ways I could not have known and did not know earlier. There are hard truths, both within myself and embedded within the nature of that world, that I never would have discovered had I not submitted to the discipline of life in this place at this time. When Ted McAllister talks about discovering the creative energies of richly encumbered lives, I know he's not being an idealist and a theorist, because I'm living it out right now in a concrete way. It took reading Mark Mitchell's essay in the collection to make me realize the ideal that I think we should all look for, creating what Mitchell calls a humane localism. That's a localism that seeks to orient our lives around long-term commitments and a recognition of natural duties, such as my duty to my mom and dad to help see them through their old age, while also learning to be tolerant, even welcoming, of genuine diversity, rejecting a fearful tribalism. An inhumane localism demonizes outsiders and nonconformists in the community, but a destructive cosmopolitanism that moves into a place and asserts the right to remake it according to one's own desires, disregarding any responsibility to the past or the future, that's bad too. We can have the tyranny of a rigid communal conservatism, or the tyranny of individual choice that pays no attention to community standards and structures. But I think that's a false choice, because neither one makes for authentic human flourishing. How we create a humane localism through policy is a difficult question, of course, and one beyond my ken, to say nothing of my kinfolks, who, like many Southerners, as I said, hold grudges like champions. But broadly speaking, in a time and place where freedom of choice is seen as more important than what is chosen, we have to make it easier for individuals to desire commitment to place more than they desire staying moving, keeping our options open. The secret, as Wendell Berry has said, is that it all turns on affection. In his 2012 Jefferson lecture, the poet Farmer said that to live in right order with the world, people must, quote, imagine their places in it. By imagination, he means the moral imagination, which sees a place illuminated by its own unique character and by our love for it. This, in turn, engenders sympathy with those who share our place, our neighbors, and produces love for that place and its people. This is why I encourage those in the room who are policymakers not to forget the powers of writers and artists to serve the cause of making good places, places that matter, places worth loving and calling home. The best arguments for why place matters are the art it produces and the good people it forms. People like my flawed but saintly and loving sister, Ruthie Lemming, and all those who walked with her through the valley of the shadow of death. There's a young woman from my town, a former student of my sister's, who went home to Nebraska after Ruthie's funeral, quit her job, and moved back to Louisiana. She told me that what did it for her was seeing the way Ruthie was allowed to die, surrounded by the love of friends and neighbors who had shared this place with her all her life, convinced her that our town was where she wanted to live. People long for that. True, not everybody wants to go back to their hometowns, but everybody wants to go to home, in the sense of having a place to call your own, and living in a place that can call you its own. They want a place where, when you die, your friends, like my sister's friends did, will sit in the church with your body all night, and laugh and sing and tell stories about you until it's time to send you off the next morning. Storytellers and saints can reveal to people what they already know deep down, that place matters, and that they have it within themselves to achieve that sense of place, that experience of home, wherever home may be, if they're willing to live within its limitations. I know at least 2 families who left lucrative careers and exciting lives in the big city to return to their hometowns as a result of reading the story I tell in my memoir, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming. Because my story, my particular story, enabled them to imagine the blessings of home as something they can not only have, but they might actually need for their own flourishing, the flourishing of their children. If you get enough people like this, inspired by artists and enabled by increased economic opportunity to move to a place or to stick with a place when they have a better job offer somewhere else, you can change things. You have to show them that remaining in place offers rewards that money literally cannot buy. Money is not going to be able to buy somebody to come by and take your kids to school when you're too sick to get out of bed, or you're too weak from your chemo to clean your house or mow your lawn. Only your neighbors and your family can do that. And this deep longing for a place to call home, as Joseph Amato says in the book, is a quote, far more compelling as a cultural force than the idealization and the quest for progress. It all turns on affection, which begins right here in the heart. Thank you for listening.